OTT is way more interesting than you might think. On the surface level, it's just a multi-band compressor that compresses a sound a lot. But there are some deeper things going on, and understanding those things will lead to a deeper understanding of music production as a whole. OTT is an effect that's used and abused like crazy. People say OTT makes a sound
powerful,
more smack to it,
more excitement,
way better, shiny.
It just seems to work in a lot of situations.
OTT is electronic music.
This type of sandwich, the baguette.
As we all know, people in the audio world love using random words to describe sounds. But in this video, I want to go beyond the adjectives and deep into what OTT is actually doing and explain why it sounds so juicy. We're going to be talking about compression, frequency distribution, dudes rocking hairdos like this, tight jeans, and loose morals, and the very history of dance music. First off, what is OTT? OTT is a multi-band compression preset in Ableton, and X4 Records released their own standalone plugin for people that don't use Ableton. So it splits the frequency spectrum up into 3 bands and compresses each band individually. This band splitting causes a phase shift around these points, which has led many people to think this is a bug, including some big names. Kashmir. If you want to learn more about this stuff, I made a video that goes deep into how EQs work and band splitting and all that stuff. Kashmir, if you're watching, check it out. So here's an example of OTT. Okay, so I threw this loop together. It has a bunch of OTTs sprinkled in. Let's listen to it. Okay, now I'm gonna go through and turn off all the OTTs. Okay, all the OTTs are off. That took way longer than I thought. I have no clue how this sounds, so. So with OTT, it's a lot fatter, more chunky. I might even say it sounds thick. But why does it sound so much better? The answer is more complicated than you might think. The first reason is the obvious one. Anybody that's used OTT will know that it compresses the crap out of a sound. Let's just look at a single frequency band for now. OTT compresses in 2 ways. It compresses the sound when it's over a certain threshold. This is called downward compression because it compresses down from the top. OTT also raises the level of a sound when it's below a certain threshold. This is called upward compression since it compresses from the bottom. Now from the top, OTT absolutely smashes a sound. These are the ratios for each of the bands. So for the low band, every dB that you input above the threshold will only raise the level by about 1/66th of a dB. Because the ratios are so high, we need long attack and release times so the dynamics aren't completely destroyed. Also, the RMS button is selected, so the compression acts on the average of a sound over time, providing smoother compression. There's a lesson to be learned here. In general, the harder you compress something, the slower you want the gain reduction to change over time. A good rule of thumb is that the higher your gain reduction, which is set by your input level, your threshold, and your ratio, the longer your attack and release time should be. So with high ratios and low thresholds, OTT just straight up punishes a sound from the top. From the bottom, it's not as extreme, but there's still a significant amount of compression. This crazy amount of compression effectively makes the quiet parts louder. By making the quiet parts louder, you bring out more of the details of a sound that you otherwise wouldn't hear. Listen to this. Sounds pretty boring, doesn't it? Now listen to what it sounds like when I compress it to death. These are the same chunks of audio, just one is being spanked by a couple compressors. So this is the first reason OTT sounds so good. The high amount of compression confines a sound into a smaller window. This brings out details that you otherwise wouldn't hear and makes a sound more interesting and full. Or, as the great Carnage would put it,
very, way more stronger.
So that's the obvious thing OTT does. Another reason OTT sounds good is because the mids aren't compressed as much as the highs and lows. This gets to the heart of an interesting topic in mixing. Why do the mids sound better when they're less compressed? It has to do with our perception of different frequency regions. Try to listen to the harmonies in this chord progression. For me personally, what I hear in this progression is this. But if I transpose this progression down 4 octaves, now listen to it. There's a lot more tonality and harmony, and this is after EQing the high chord progression so that all the tones have roughly the same loudness. We're most sensitive to harmonic relationships in the mids. So I have this loop. Let's listen to it with each band selected. So this is what it's like with the entire thing. And now let's hear it with just the lows. So there's not a lot of melody there, as you can hear. All I hear is that sub playing that one note and then some of the drums. But like the melody's basically gone when I isolate the low end. And let's isolate the high end now. So there's more melody in the high end, but it's still like, there's still not a lot of melody there. It's mostly just the texture from all of the higher harmonics of the mid elements and then all of the percussive elements. But when I isolate the mids, so you can hear basically all of the melodies now. And you might be saying, well, you made the song that way. Yeah, that's true. But if I put all of the melodic elements in the low end, it would just sound messy. And if we put it in the high end, as we saw earlier, you wouldn't be able to really determine the harmonies and chords playing. All of the elements that really carry a song emotionally are in the mids. It's easier for our ears to lock on to melodies and harmonies when they're in the mids. There's this saying, I forget who said it, but it's something like, the music is in the mids. And this is the reason why. So why do we have to compress the mids less then? Because when you compress a bunch of sounds together, it causes all of their dynamics to be more similar. Remember, dynamics is just how volume changes over time. The difference in dynamics between two sounds is one of the most important things that allow us to differentiate between sounds. So if the mids are extremely compressed, there'll be less separation between instruments and can make it harder for us to determine harmonic relationships. And since the majority of the music lives in the mids, the entire song will have less clarity, but the mids are still being compressed like crazy. It's just less than the highs and lows. So that's another reason OTT sounds good. But there's something else OTT does that's a little sneaky. The third reason OTT sounds so good is the output gain. OTT boosts the highs and lows by about 10 dB, but only boosts the mids by 5.5 dB. And this is really important because, as we saw earlier, the sound gets confined to a much smaller dynamic range, and the lows and highs are compressed more than the mids. By applying these makeup gain knobs, we sort of push the frequency distribution to be more U-shaped. Now, why is this important? We know our ears are most sensitive in the mid-range frequencies in terms of how we perceive harmonic relationships, but our ears are also most sensitive in the mids in terms of how loud we perceive things. You might have heard of this thing called an equal loudness contour, which is just a graph that tells us how our perception of loudness changes over the frequency spectrum. For example, a 50 Hz wave would need to be about 20 dB higher to have the same loudness as a frequency at 200 Hz. The frequency response of our ears looks roughly like this. So for a wave that has equal intensity across the spectrum, the mids would sound loudest to us. Now there's a small bump here, and I'll talk about that in another video. But in order to make the highs and lows roughly equal to the loudness of the mids, we have to turn them up. And this is the exact same kind of boosting that OTT does. This U-shaped curve compensates for the fact that we perceive the mids louder, and this is roughly the shape of the equal loudness contours. The equal loudness contours are basically the frequency response of our ears flipped upside down. If there's one thing you take out of this video, it's that our ears are attuned to the mids. Now it's important to note that OTT won't necessarily create this U-shaped frequency distribution, but rather massages a sound to be more U-shaped. But even in some cases it won't do this. For example, if the level of a sound is below roughly 35 dB, the downward compression won't be high enough to give this shape. Also, if you have a lot of high frequencies you're passing into OTT, since all those frequencies are contributing to the gain reduction, the output will be less. You can see this here. I'm passing white noise into an EQ and then into OTT. See how the highs are at a lower level than the mids? Now I'm going to slowly bring in a high cut and watch the maximum level of the highs. It increases. I'm taking frequencies away and it's making the frequencies that are left louder. This is because the high frequencies I cut out are no longer contributing to the gain reduction, but the output gain is still the same. So by cutting some of the highs, I increase the level of the other high frequencies. The band itself effectively has the same level, just the frequency contributions to that level are different. So OTT accentuates the highs and lows, but it only really works when there's not a lot of frequencies in those regions to begin with. This is why OTT will make a sound huge if those regions are lacking, but it won't do much if those regions are chock full of frequencies. And I think most people wouldn't use OTT in that situation. So in order for there to be equal loudness across the whole spectrum, we have to boost the highs and lows. This shape is so common that it has a name, the disco smile. This EQ shape became popular when disco exploded in the 70s. And disco was really the first kind of modern dance music with its thumping 4-on-the-floor kick drum beat that hit you in the chest. There's this guy named David Mancuso who would hold these gigantic underground parties. They were raves before raves were a thing. And he introduced the technology of tweeter arrays, which are basically just small clusters of speakers dedicated to high frequency content. He also added additional subwoofers, and he would turn on these extra tweeters and subwoofers at certain moments to really emphasize sections of a song, almost like a drop.
Sub bass, how low will it go? So you sort of create this cabinet with these speakers in there to create this effect.
This was the start of bass-heavy dance music, but this disco smile, it's more like a disco grin, didn't just permeate dance music. There's this other guy named Leo Fender who made amps, and he would design his amps with this mid-range scoop as well, or, as he would say, sweet on the bottom, hard on the top. I think he also made guitars too. Now, why this smile shape has persisted for all these years is up for debate. Some people think it's because people like having a loud bass and the highs need to be turned up so they don't get drowned out by the bass. Some people think it's to give loudness compensation for hi-fi systems as the volume was turned down, because hi-fi purists wouldn't want to use the built-in tone control because they had to stick up their ass. I hate audio purists, but the reason I think it's persisted all these years is because it just sounds good. This disco smile gives a clarity from the boosted highs and a powerful deep bass from the boosted lows. And these two things contrast each other amazingly. Since the highs and lows are so far apart, they can both be turned up to stand out of the mix and don't really conflict with each other. I touched on this in my EQ video. Cutting between frequency regions causes both regions to stand out more. I'll put a link to that timestamp in the video description. It's kind of interesting how this disco smile frequency distribution arose in the disco era, and disco music with its thumping 4-on-the-floor kick drum beat eventually gave rise to house music and techno and trance and a bunch of the electronic music that we have today. So while we think OTT is this new thing that's being abused by people making electronic music, it has a deep connection to dance music that goes back 50 years. Now, obviously with the loudness wars, we've taken these ideas and cranked them over the top, but the ideas are fundamentally the same. OTT is a complete package of what producers and mixers and event promoters had to do manually back in the day. We are so lucky that we live in a time where we can make music on a computer and use effects like OTT to streamline the process. Trends come and go, but the fundamentals of why certain mixes pop, it's all the same stuff. So I'm trying hard to make this not just another production YouTube channel. I'm trying to grow this channel with a bunch of weird and obscure production topics like this video. If you found this video helpful, hit like and subscribe. And if there's a topic that you think the internet is sleeping on, comment it below and I'll see if I can make a video about it. Anyway, thanks for watching.